Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Prof Talk Pod, the podcast where we give you strategies, techniques, and tips to help you become a better teacher. And with me, as always, is Galen Clavio. Always seems like a long time when it's only episode 6. I think I have to wait till we're at like 30 to say always. But he...
Fine. Okay. Gee. I'm starting to wonder if I'm getting replaced around episode 12 now.
Yeah, I do have a limit. You know, I have this sheet, and it's like, this is the cutoff. No, I'm very excited to have Galen with me, as always. And our topic this episode is to talk about ways to handle the, I guess what feels often inevitable student or two students who come to us at the end of the semester and maybe they've been less engaged in the course, they're missing some assignments, and maybe they did poorly, and they're graduating in December. And if they don't pass your class, they can't graduate. Or maybe they're an athlete who needs your class to be eligible and they didn't realize how the course had gone so far or how far behind they'd gotten, especially if they're in season. And you are trying to figure out, especially as a new faculty member, I think this is really difficult when you're a new teacher to think about, like, how do I deal with this? How do I approach this? You first of all have to, think about so many competing perspectives and organizational things that may impact the answer to this. And so I think it was a space for Galen and I to just talk a little bit about some of the ways that maybe we've approached students in the past. And I think, for me, a lot of it, when I started out, I was like, I didn't accept late work. I, didn't have a very good policy for finding ways to help students be successful. And I was a very much like, we do this and this is how we do it. And if you don't do it this way, too bad for you. You will hopefully learn from that. And I don't know how it kind of evolved a little bit after seeing so many students with many challenges, trying to balance a lot of things. I started to recognize that while they might want to be in school and they do care about their education is not the only thing they're trying to do. And for me, it was, I stopped wanting to think about, well, who's worth, whose excuse is good enough? And I wanted to think about ways that I could help students be successful generally. And even if that means maybe changing some of those policies. So I'm not one of those people, actually, I don't know if you are, Galen, I don't have like an 85-page syllabus with 30 policies about how everything will go in the course. I do whatever the university requires for policies, but otherwise, I like to have opportunities for me to talk with students and learn situations and figure out ways forward that help them be successful. Because, there's been times in my life where like it just wasn't going to happen. Like I couldn't do something or I didn't do something to that standard I wanted to. And,
right.
I understand that happened. So I'm curious though, from your teaching perspective, not the administrative one, but we're going to get to that. When a student walks into your office and in the 11th hour and says, I can't get a D, like, what's your perspective? Where do you come at that from?
It's tough because I think with a lot of the situations like that transpire, you really do have to take it on an individual basis, but that gets harder to do the larger the class is. So I generally teach classes that are either 18 or 125, two very different scenarios. With 125, I generally don't have a lot of work outside of exams, and then there's normally one project that they'll either partner on or do by themselves. And I try to make it very clear when things are due. I try to have a very clear policy as far as like, if you miss this or if you don't turn it in on time, there's going to be point penalties. And I just try to keep that consistent. And so when a student comes in and is like, I can't afford to get this bad of a grade, it doesn't feel great to say this, but you almost have to, in my opinion, if you're going to be fair. And this is what I'll tell students, like I have to be fair to the rest of the class. Everybody's been operating under the same guidelines. They're very flexible guidelines for the most part. And then it's true. Like, I will set my guidelines up in a way where I give a lot of leeway for certain situations. But if you just haven't bothered to engage with those, and then you're coming in at the end of the semester and essentially trying to make up for your lack of engagement, a lot of times there I'm making a judgment. It's like, I'm sorry, like this, there's limits to what I'm willing to do. I want to be helpful, but you're basically subverting the educational nature of the class because you're asking ultimately for a grade that you didn't earn based upon work you didn't do in a timetable that you didn't adhere to that everybody else did. And, That isn't to say that I've never granted exceptions. I try to be sensitive to student situations, but I also think that this is where you have to communicate consistently throughout the course of a class, and it's where you have to set your class up. I try to think of it like, if I've got a 16-week class, to try to derail requests at the end of the semester, I try to set it up so that everything's compartmentalized throughout the course of the semester. And it's like, by this date, you're going to have these points. You're going to know that that's part of your overall point total. By this date, you're going to have more, and so on and so forth. And, what I find is if I consistently communicate, like, hey, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, like for those first couple of situations where we've got assignments or exams that have to be done, I'm happy to talk with you if you're concerned about your trajectory. But if you're not going to say anything, you're not going to get like special consideration at the end of the semester simply because now you're in a position where you need something that you didn't earn. And, I think of setting that boundary, setting that guideline early on, and just letting people, I've even gotten to the point, and I know several other people have gotten to the point where, they'll put in their syllabus, like, I don't review grades that are already in the grade book, because you just open yourself up to a circumstance where now you're doing a lot of additional work and you're having to make special accommodations for students that, while they may need the help, probably have not done the work that would lend itself to thinking this person deserves the flexibility or the leeway. So it's tough. And again, with smaller classes, it's a little bit different in that I'm working with those students on a lot more of an individual basis. But I would almost argue with those, I can tell pretty early what students are going to have problems. And so I try to work with them ahead of time to get them on the right foot, or to at the very least communicate to them, look, the trajectory you're on here is not going to turn out well. So please fix this, because I'm not going to save you at the end of the semester by giving you a grade that you didn't earn. And again, that might sound a little harsh, but I do think that students react well to good fences. Students react well to guidelines that say you need to do this and this and this. And as long as you can give them the details ahead of time and the deadlines ahead of time, they'll normally do those things. I think when it's more amorphous and more fuzzy, and I think a lot of instructors and professors fall into this trap because we want to be helpful. We want to provide help to students when they need it. But there are a certain section of students that will just take advantage of that. And that is what you really need to avoid as an instructor, is walking yourself into a situation where you have to accommodate them because you're trying to be quote unquote fair. You might not end up being fair after all in that process.
Yeah, definitely. I think the fairness thing is something to unpack, because that oftentimes is what it comes down to for me. I never offer one student something that I don't in turn offer to the rest of the class. And for me, there have certainly been times where there were things, there were assignments, maybe I've got 4 or 5 students who are really close to not failing. And so I will offer the entire class an opportunity to do an extra assignment. From my experience, oftentimes the students who are already failing don't take advantage of that.
Right.
It's the students who are almost at an A that take advantage of it. But for me, it's always, every single time, if I'm extending a deadline, I'm extending that deadline for every student. Right. And if students have already turned it in, I still tell them, if you want to revise it and turn something else in, because I do think the fairness piece is one. I had a couple students a few years ago, 3 or 4 in the same class, that were struggling with different things. And I remember talking to my husband about it, and I said, this one student emailed me, told me their situation, asked how they can be successful. And as I was thinking about how to respond to that, I was like, well, what if these 3 other students are just scared and intimidated, and maybe, or culturally, they're not supposed to ask somebody in my position to do something extra for them. And so the only reason they don't have that opportunity is because they were too scared to ask.
Right.
So that's kind of where I finally was like, as he and I were talking about it, he's like, well, but that's their own fault for being too scared to ask. At the same time, though, it is the relationship between a professor and students. Not all students, even if you work to build rapport, not all students are there yet. I still have students who, most of my students call me Becky. I have students who never could get over that hump. It was always going to be Dr. Achen, because that's just how they are. And I think the same thing can happen in situations like this. So for me, right. I do really think that fairness piece is essential, and sometimes also is an opportunity when you have a student who's asking you to do something that is very clearly, on a broad scale, unfair to the students who've already done the things. You can also say to that student, I understand this has been a difficult semester for you. Here are the ways I've already tried to help all students be successful. It's unfortunate that you weren't able to take advantage of those things or didn't take advantage of those things, but out of fairness, I cannot offer you this because not everybody else had the chance. And sometimes that helps that conversation when we know life's not fair, but we also need to make sure that we're holding a standard that is similar across our students. Just because somebody's not willing to ask doesn't mean they shouldn't have an opportunity.
And it's interesting because the flip side of that particular paradigm is something that a lot of professors struggle with earlier in their careers, which is the number of people that I've worked with as instructors and professors who are convinced that if a student asks them for something, they have to do it, is really remarkable. And it's one of those things you don't think about, but it is, I remember a lot of the people I was doing the doc program with that I was in, they get into trouble because a student would come up after class or come up towards the end of the semester and say, well, I need to get a better grade on this exam. And they almost felt compelled to listen to the student. And this goes back to our previous episode because they were worried they were going to get a bad evaluation if they didn't accommodate the student. And so, on the one hand, you've got students that are too afraid to ask. On the other hand, you've got students that all they do is ask. Yeah, and they're convinced that they can lobby you to do anything. And I think, again, it's a complicated space. And it's, there are some gender dynamics involved. There are some cultural differences involved where, there, in some cases, as you said, there's people that are coming from cultures where you don't ask people in authority for things. Then there's people coming from cultures where you aggressively bully people into trying to do what you want them to do. And it's hard to parse that as an instructor when you're essentially supposed to treat all students the same, even though the students are not themselves acting the same. And so as you get closer to the end of the semester, one of the things I think is important is, first of all, you have to have a framework and you have to have something that you can refer back to that you started the class with. And this is something that has to almost be iterative over the course of your career, because there will be things that will happen in the classroom or with students in classes that you would have never anticipated when you first started teaching. And there's not a lot you can do to prep for that other than you experience it, you deal with it the best you can, and then you add something to your syllabus the next time that specifically addresses that situation and says this is not allowed. And you have to have a clearer sense as an instructor of how you're going to handle moments when people are asking you for things that you don't feel comfortable providing. It's hard to learn to say no, but it's also, I think, important for students to hear no, because a lot of students, going all the way back to their high school days, are used to getting what they want when they ask for it as a replacement for doing the work along the way like everybody else is supposed to be doing. And so a lot of it is, can I set the framework? Can I tell people ahead of time, here's what to expect. Here's how these situations are going to be dealt with. Here's how you have to react in the moment. And then if there are penalties for not doing those things, they're clearly delineated in the syllabus, and you can say, if someone's upset about that, look, this was explained at the beginning of the semester. If you have a compelling reason why this shouldn't apply, we can have a conversation. But that short circuits, at least from my experience, a lot of the unreasonable asks that occur, because at least you've got some documentation that backs up what you're doing, and you can say, look, whether you like it or not, this is how the class was set up. You agreed to do it this way. And it also, I think, though, opens up the ability to communicate with students and have conversations with them about why you're doing things that way. And again, a lot of it comes back to the framing of the class and how you're presenting it to students and how they view their work and their obligations within that classroom setting.
And I think the framework is something that you have to be comfortable with. You can't go in with somebody else's ideas and then try to hold a line that you don't necessarily believe in. And for me, I have two policies that they have other reasons. So I allow revisions for every single assignment in my class all semester long, multiple revisions if you so choose to take them. And I tell students that up front, any work that they do can be revised to earn more points with my feedback For me, I do that primarily because I think iteration is really, really important in the learning process. That's how we write academic papers. I don't know anybody who's had a first draft accepted at a journal.
Yeah, hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet. I don't think it is possible. If you have, put that in the comments. I would love to know. But I think that iterative process is really important for learning. And so I do it for that reason, but I also do it so that students feel empowered to have some impact on their grades, so that if my grading is quote unquote harsh, which I've gotten many times in my career, there's an opportunity for you to go back and earn points and use that feedback. And hopefully with me, the goal is for you to actually learn the thing that I wanted you to learn in the first place. And the other policy I have, which my husband calls me a bleeding heart. I think everybody does now, but I allow late work. I tell students at the beginning of the semester that I accept late work. I think about that acceptance of late work similar to the way that I feel about organizations that have stopped having vacation time. You just take whatever days off you want to take off. There is no set.
Right.
When I approach late work from a similar perspective of I will accept it if you turn it in, I don't get very much late work. Very, very little late work.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's some of the, students know it's there as a fallback, but they don't take advantage of it because they ideally, we talk about, when I tell them about this policy, I say, I don't recommend not turning anything in till the end of the semester because one, if you don't turn it in till the end, you won't be able to revise it because there will be no time between when I have to turn grades in and when you turned it in. And two, you won't be able to learn the things that you need to learn in this class very effectively. And so I don't have students who are like waiting until the end of the semester to turn everything in. I get late work here and there, but most students email me and tell me why, which is fine. I don't actually need to know. In fact, I tell them I don't need to know why it's late, but that has allowed me to have very positive, fewer of these conversations at the end of the semester. And when I do have them, I can say, I understand this semester has been hard for you for X, Y, Z, whatever reason you shared with me. But these are the two policies I have that have been set there to help in case something happened and you weren't able to keep up with the work. So you have had the opportunity the whole semester to turn these things in. And I can't just magically give you another week or give you an incomplete so you can finish the work that you've had the whole semester to do. So those conversations are a little bit easier because I've already given them opportunities. And then if they go to my administrator and say, Dr. Achen isn't being fair, there's not really much they can do to support that I'm not being fair because the policies are there to really help them.
Well, and it's interesting because I will sometimes accept late work, but there's always a point penalty attached to it. And my stance is, well, fine, you can turn it in late. I'll grade it like normal, but you can't get full credit for it because you didn't turn it in on time, and everybody else that did turn it in on time is going to get full credit. And so, what I found is like a lot of times students, like they want to get a passing grade. They want to get a grade that they can move forward on. They may not be hyper-focused on getting an A.
Right.
But they're fine with a B or a B minus. And a lot of students, if they need to, they know they have that flexibility. Because again, ultimately, it's like your grading scale and what you're actually allowing people to get graded on and how that factors into their overall grade. I mean, it's easy to say, well, I'm going to be really flexible and I'm going to take everybody's like personal situations into account. But after a while, you struggle a little bit, I think, with maintaining any kind of consistency when you do that. And I'm glad that's working for you. I would struggle with allowing late work consistently as a course policy. I use it more as an exception where it's like, yes, I will allow you to do this. You're not going to get the same grade you would have if you turned it in on time. But unless you just don't turn it in, period, you're going to get something for it. And I do think that at least there they get the feedback loop that we've talked about before on the podcast, so they get an idea of what they did well, what they need to do better. I do think that's important. But I think it's also important, particularly in media that I teach, like deadlines and turning things on time is so important that it would be inconsistent with what I'm trying to train them to do. If I was just like, you can just turn it in whenever, or you can revise it. It's like you have to, in my world, you got to turn things in and you got to give it your best effort the first time. And that, is as much a part of the assignment as the actual content of the assignment.
Yeah, and I definitely recognize that approach is maybe not for everyone from a personality perspective, or, it is, I would imagine some of you are like, that sounds like a lot of work. It is. It is a lot of work to grade assignments multiple times. To be honest, not very many students take advantage of either of those policies. And it helps defray some of the concerns at the end. I really struggled with the late work piece for a very long time because similar to you, like life has deadlines, jobs have deadlines. And I think if in a graduate class, I'm probably a little more specific about, I will accept late work, but you should tell me why it's going to be late. Just like I'm your boss and you had a project that you for whatever reason weren't able to finish. Because once I had kids, I was like, oh my gosh, I can never do anything on time again. Literally nothing. and so I understand that in a working world, that's a reality. Sometimes we do miss deadlines. And so for graduate students, I'm often like, let's talk through how you talk to your boss about something that's going to be late and why it's going to be late. And then how do we backwards plan so next time it's not late? And that can help. For undergraduates, I think, sometimes I'm trying not to do too much in the class. Like, I feel the same way about them being late. I used to go crazy when a student walked in late. And then I was like, I don't know.
No, that's a larger thing altogether. Like, I have a 125 person lecture right now in the class I'm teaching. I got about 50 people coming per class. And, I'm really at the point where I say it's not my job to make you come to class. I'd like it if you were there, and certainly it's a little more fulfilling if I feel like I'm lecturing to a full class as opposed to half a class. But, I look at the not coming to class at all the same way I look at coming in late, in that, okay, it's a personal choice. If you're disruptive, that's one thing.
Right.
If you're not disruptive, but you're just late, well, I was late before. I'm not going to get too torqued out about that. But, I will say that, historically what I've found is the students who are consistently late or at least showing up, I'll normally pull them aside the second time it happens, and I'll say, what's the deal? And if it's, well, gosh, I got to get all the way across campus from this other class, okay, fine. If they don't have a good excuse, well, that's where I start to be like, all right, you've got to start making an effort to get here more on time. And generally that will lead to them actually getting there on time because they realize that they're going to have to account for the fact that they're walking in late constantly. And but it's like, again, a lot of it really comes down to this idea of college is a tough time. And I kind of, in terms of like you're transitioning to being an adult, you're transitioning to having responsibilities that you are responsible for as opposed to your parents forcing you to be responsible for them. Everybody transitions a little bit differently. I feel like on the one hand, there's a leniency that I want to have in terms of being able to deal with situations where you get in over your head, but I also want to establish standards because standards are going to continue to be established for you, not just as a student, but when you graduate and you're going out and working in the world, at some point you have to start thinking, well, someone's judging me based upon whether I'm hitting these intangible elements just as much as I'm hitting the tangible elements of the assignment or whatever I'm doing. And so I think it's a balance. And this is where, I remember I've read a lot of coaching manuals over the course of time. And one of the things that the coaches that I really respect and who I think do a great job note is like, you can't treat everybody the same in terms of their conduct, because there are good-natured people or well-meaning people who make mistakes. Right. And then there are people who are not well-natured who do things because they can. That's a very different set of populations. Yeah. And, you have to be able to kind of evaluate each class and figure out what types of people you're dealing with and understand that by treating everybody the same, you're almost allowing the people who are taking advantage of the situation far more leeway than you should, and that's actually bad for them because it continually reinforces that they can act however they want without any kind of repercussion. And after a while, if we're going to maintain rigor, whatever the hell that means in higher ed, that's thrown around so much, where does the rigor come from? Some of it has to be in the expectations of behavior.
Yeah, I think the line there that you were talking about when you mentioned sometimes it's bad for them is where there are definitely going to be times, and this happens for me too, where it is actually better for me to tell the student, you have exhausted all opportunities for points in this class. I know that this might be difficult for you because you're going to have to retake this course, you're going to have to push graduation, I understand and this is the empathy part, like I'm not judging you for that, but at some point there is learning in that failure. And if we never let students fail, they can't learn. And I definitely have had students at the end of the day, there was nothing more I could do. And that probably, hopefully, maybe taught, I like to think all of those things taught them something, maybe something they really needed to learn in that moment. And I'm hopeful. And the negative part, I think, of being a teacher, especially in a large class, is that you often don't get to know what happens with that student. Right. I don't know if that student ever actually learned something, got it together, and moved forward. I don't know what happened to them. I think maybe that's part of my bleeding heartness is like, I will not get to finish this learning moment and to know what happens. And I want to help them be successful because I don't want to have to worry about that, which I think that line is like nearly impossible to determine.
Well, you're never going to know. You have to accrue ideas as you move through teaching about what is actually being imparted and what your students are learning. Because like you said, you have a very short amount of time most of the time with those students. Even if you have them in an additional class down the line, it may not be the same kind of an environment. But all you can do is come up with a set of standards you're comfortable with, enforce those. And then when you have students as they go through the semester who are legitimately troubled and are having issues, find ways to help them, but don't do so in a way that endangers the integrity of what you're trying to get across in the classroom writ large. Because if you're setting a standard of behavior for the whole class, making individual exceptions can be good and can be the right thing to do, but it can also create an environment where you're letting some students do less to get the same benefit as students who actually did what was asked of them in the first place. And I do think that should factor into the equation.
I do understand why. I sometimes think, though, occasionally to myself, that those things will work themselves out in the working world, and the students that are doing less to get by will probably not be the athletic directors of tomorrow, even though they want to be. And the students who put the extra in, while they may get a similar grade to that student, grades are, we've talked about this, mostly meaningless, right? So in the working world, that student who is learning how to put the extra in is going to get further, most if they want to, not all the time they do. And the student who was not meeting expectations isn't. And while I agree that it's part of our job to help them move toward meeting those expectations, it's a really difficult balance between doing that and providing space for students to make those mistakes and still be able to survive the academic program and not have to start all over. So, yeah.
I think it's a good way to close things off. Absolutely.
I agree. Okay. So thank you all for joining us for episode 6. As always, if you found this valuable, I would love for you to share it with a friend, send comments, give us questions, give us ideas for things you want us to talk about. And as always, thank you for joining us.